Thank you for these blessings, Lord.
And the sanctions, the anti-sanctions movement. How has that been?
That's actually interesting that you bring up the point, because the purpose of the sanctions was to ensure that they cripple the agricultural space. So make sure that there are no seeds, make sure there's no fertilizers, make sure there's no mechanization, make sure that there is no capital within the financial institutions like ScotFin.
Yeah.
And Zimbabwe, ZB Bank,
yeah,
which used to be Zimbank, that used to finance small-scale farmers. They made sure that they crippled those financial institutions so that they don't have resources to give to farmers.
Did they close down?
So what had happened is that most of our agricultural production was actually not from commercial farms, specifically when it came to staple foods. Mm-hmm. Staple foods, beef, cotton, groundnuts. It was actually coming from the small-scale rural farmer. And so this small-scale rural farmer used to get small-term loans from financial institutions like Zimbank, Intermarket, and other institutions like ScotFin. And so the moment that we had sanctions, the sanctions targeted these very same banking institutions so that they could no longer have money or loans to give to these small-scale farmers. They also damaged the value chain of the buyers of the product. So GMB, a government institution, a parastatal, would not have money because of reduction in taxes and because of the government not getting any more loans, could not pay the farmers for whatever produce they produce. So this destroyed the entire production value chain, which many people perceived to be undertaken by commercial farmers, when it was actually the small-scale farmer and the rural farmer that were producing this. But what we saw is that Zimbabwe has begun to get resilient. They've begun to learn how to produce, and even the government has begun to learn to get new sources of income to lend these farmers. And then the commercial banks like CBZ have jumped into the equation to fill the gap that was there with people like ScotFin before. And these institutions have been put under sanctions. Intermarket was under sanctions, ZB Bank was under sanctions, CBZ was under sanctions, deliberately by the West, trying to make sure that there won't be funding for these black farmers and these small-scale farmers. Wow. So that they could say that Zimbabweans or black people cannot produce. Why? Because they don't want the South Africans to take land. They don't want the Namibians to take land. They want commercial farming to continue to dictate the pace on the African continent. And the reason they want that is then they can weaponize the food at will. They can begin to tamper with the seeds, make sure that the seeds are hybrids, make sure that we're dependent on fertilizers and pesticides so that we destroy our soils, and then we have toxins and poisons going into our water systems, which then causes a crisis. Now, I'll give you a perfect example. When you go to America and you stop at what they call turnpike service stations, yeah, you will get a list for those people that go fishing, because fishing is big in America, that warn you that you cannot eat certain fish more than once a year, because they're so toxic with chemicals that come from farming and industry that you cannot eat more than one, otherwise you're going to get sick.
And do you know, because I like to eat very healthy, I would even often say that I think seafood would be the best right now, because you can't get a GMO seafood or, you know, something that is tempered around, because that's where they naturally live, in the water. But right. What you're telling me is that's shocking.
The water bodies have become so toxic that the fish themselves are so filled with chemicals that in America they will warn you that if you eat one pike, you can't eat more pike for the whole year. But it's also going back into our oceans, because these rivers then rush into our oceans, take the very same chemicals into the oceans, and now you've got a lot of sea fish and seafood has become toxic with mercury and macroplastics. So all these fibers that we're wearing in garments, they go into our washing machines, they release microfibers. Those microfibers go into the water system. The water system has got little plankton, little bacteria that eat them. The little plankton are then eaten by crabs and prawns, and then that goes into the system of fish eating them. And then we have biomagnification in the bigger fish that then become toxic with these microplastics, plus mercury and other chemicals. And that's why you're seeing that even seafood is no longer safe for us to eat, because we've contaminated the entire system. And I've always said civilization came with a culture of defecating in the water we drink. African culture always said never defecate where you eat or where you drink. But civilization, Western civilization, brought the culture of defecating in the water that you drink. We give mining companies mining licenses to put cyanide into our drinking water, and then we deprive normal people of clean drinking water. And we think that's development. But ultimately, this development has actually made our environment, our food systems toxic.
That's literally crippling everything. It's a whole vicious cycle. It goes round and round. Do you know, as we sit here at the Davos right now, they're meeting, the global elites are meeting to talk about how much more they can push the agenda of weaponizing food. So now we see the uprising of farmers in different countries. You just gave an example of what happened in Zimbabwe when the farmers were literally crippled. They couldn't get borrowings for money to actually produce on a commercial scale. Same thing is also happening in Europe.
Yes.
Right now we've got the German farmers that are literally protesting. The same thing happened with the Dutch farmers.
Yes.
But I think the most important question right now is, so which food is which? You speak about the funding. There's somebody who's behind the funding. Even if we talk about corporate food institutions, which I think has become the biggest problem right now that different countries are actually facing. Can we talk about those?
Absolutely. Right now, as we speak, I'm sitting here across you. I've got a case in the courts in South Africa where I commented about this weaponization of food and the corporate control of our food systems. And within that, I mentioned a corporation or a brand. And that brand went to the South African courts. It's a Zimbabwean brand. It chose to skip the Zimbabwean courts and decided to come to the South African courts to gag me from speaking about that particular company. And I believe that this speaks to what you're talking about, the corporatization of the food system, where corporations now control entire value chains of our food system, and our countries are dependent on these corporations for food. And so we have a situation in South Africa right now where the entire food system is controlled by foreign, Western companies that control the seed, because most of the seed for the staples of this country are genetically modified. These genetically modified seeds then do not reproduce, and you need a license to use these GMOs. And if your government allows farmers to reproduce the seeds and to regrow them, they suffer penalties and can be taken to the World Trade Organization for allowing the use of these seeds without license.
Whoa.
So what happens is that these seeds are controlled by only 3 companies in the world, Monsanto being the biggest, and then Bayer Monsanto being the biggest. Then you've got people like Syngenta, and then DuPont and Dell. These guys control the seeds, and they give them to countries, and these seeds can cross-pollinate, eliminate the traditional seeds that were in the country, and then the rural farmer does not have any seeds to put in the ground. And I witnessed this when we went to Limpopo 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
We went to Limpopo looking for what we call hard-body chickens, or what are called roadrunner chickens in Zimbabwe.
And we grew up eating those.
We grew up eating those.
It's everywhere in Africa, actually.
It's everywhere in Africa.
Yeah.
And so I expected to find those in Limpopo. And we had been told by the people that we're talking to in Limpopo that we could find them, because I've got a huge customer base that want these hard-body chickens. Drove all the way to Limpopo, went to the village. We struggled to get hard-body chickens. In what we called villages, they are now townships. In some of the most backward areas of Limpopo, these places have become townships. They've become very crowded. They've become high-density suburbs where there is no more land for agriculture. All the land that was used for agriculture previously is now being built up. So we spoke to some of the elders in the community. Where can we get these hard-body chickens? They said, you can't get these hard-body chickens, because where you see houses now, those used to be our fields. Oh. Now those fields have got houses. We've turned into townships. Our villages no longer have land, and our villages no longer have land to produce maize, groundnuts, or anything else. One of the elders said, when I was 13 in 1963, my parents grew groundnuts. That we were able to eat these groundnuts from 1963 all the way to 1967 from one season of farming. But right now, we are no longer farming, so we no longer produce. So we're dependent on the chain stores to provide us commercial food grown by commercial farmers that use the GMOs that are produced and provided by the Americans.
Swathes of the land.
Yes. And so once they've grown all these rural lands into townships, the only other land that exists is in the hands of commercial farmers who are white and have held that land from apartheid. They stole that land, but are not willing to give it back to the black people. So the black people become food insufficient.
Insufficient, yeah.
They cannot produce their own food. So when they get laid off, they cannot go home, grow food, and be able to provide for themselves, which is what can happen in Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Mozambique. Zimbabweans, Zambians, and Mozambique come to South Africa as refugees, but when they get chased away, when they get arrested as illegal immigrants and they go back home, they always have a village to go back to. They've got a water source, they've got seed, and they've got land. So the Limpopo problem is not only a land issue, but they also don't have the seeds to put in the ground. Because all the traditional seeds that their grandfathers, grandmothers used to keep have been destroyed by cross-pollination. And in fact, it is said that Agri-SA went into these villages, asked the villagers to give them their old seeds. They took the old seeds and gave these villagers the GMOs and seeds that don't reproduce.
Oh, no. That is deceit at the highest level. Probably even told them lies that they're giving them seeds that are better because of climate change, so they don't have to worry about a rainy season that doesn't come. So this is a seed that will actually work for you.
And the problem is our Africans, and including our government officials, our guys that have doctorates and degrees in agriculture, they've bought into the lie that a hybrid or genetically modified seed can produce more. But you ask a person to use their common sense that how can a seed that produces once, twice, or 3 times in its life be more productive than a seed that reproduces consistently for millions of years
for a lifetime,
and adapts
literally
over time to the climate? Like now, you need a seed that can adapt to the climate change. That in nature built in for seeds and crops to be able to adapt to nature. That's why the bushes continue to adapt. That's why the bushes continue to feed wild animals without being hybridized and without being genetically modified, because they adapt with the times.
Yeah. So now, you know, when we talk about these corporate food institutions, it doesn't end there. So there's an option that people have been given, but don't realize that it's the worst thing that they could ever do to themselves. Fast food chains.
Yes.
Fast food chains don't just wake up in the morning and have the chicken there. They have their own chicken farms. They have their own lettuce farms, vegetable farms. And these foods are controlled as well. And then they are sold to the masses of people. Do you know how many franchises and fast food outlets are out there in the world? Not only in Africa, but world over.
100%. And
so who really owns these? Who's behind it?
And that's a very good question, because you have these fast food outlets producing fast food. Some of them are backward integrating, where they go to a point where they control the chickens and chicks and fertilized eggs that you use in the production of these fast food chickens, eggs, and products. They control the production of the piglets and pork. They even control the production of the calves that will then become part and parcel of the value chain, right? And then they control the feed that is fed to these animals.
Yeah.
Then after that, they go into selling these meat products and competing with local competitors, but the local competitors are dependent on this very same monopoly to go and get their chicks, their piglets, and their calves, and the feed to feed them. And they're supposed to compete with this monopoly that they're still competing with in the food industry. It's impossible for you to compete with a monopoly that controls the entire value chain.
I think that's the key word there. Everything is monopolized. So you can't even get into the chain of things for you to also be a supplier unless you comply
100%
with their rules and regulations.
And what happens is, if you choose to be a competitor, to say, I want to go to compete and have a different strategy, they will take you on a price war, because they can then control the feed you get. They can then control the eggs that you get. They can control the fertilized egg that you get, or the chick, or the pork, or the calf that you get. And so you will never be able to compete with them. So there's collusion that begins to happen in that kind of an environment, where this dominant player determines what other players do and determines what price they set their products at, or else they die. But that's no longer a competitive market. That's now an oligopoly. And that is not in the public interest. It does not help people or a country to progress. And this is happening in Africa. And my question is, how can we be said to be independent African countries when our food is controlled by usually European companies, charter companies?
Yeah.
And I have seen reports in which there are links between some of these companies with intelligence organizations of the West. Links to Mossad, links to MI6.
Sorry, say that again. So these food companies have links to the intelligence?
Some of the food companies that we have dominating our food systems in Africa, in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique, Malawi, they have links and control with MI6, CIA, Mossad.
For what purposes?
That is the question we're all asking. Some of them have links with organizations like Lever Brothers that was known from Congo time, where Leopold was said to have oppressed the Congolese people and caused a genocide. One of the biggest companies that was causing that genocide with Leopold was Unilever, to get palm oil from Congo. They were part and parcel of supporting Leopold's system so that they can acquire palm oil at a cheap price by enslaving the people. They had private armies that would go and enslave the Congolese people, take their land, and force them to work without pay. Unilever continues to be an element in our system, and it has relationships with key corporate companies in South Africa, key corporate companies in Zimbabwe that control our food system. They are not indigenous companies, and they are taking answers, they're answering to and giving information to agencies that are not African, and intelligence agencies of foreign countries that are inimical to Africa.
That is the greatest, or should I say the highest level of weaponizing food. It ends up in the intelligence offices to understand how a country is distributing its food, is controlling its food, the food patterns of a country. It's unbelievable to hear that. Now, having said that, I want to talk about the farmers that are actually protesting. You know, the Dutch government planned on seizing thousands of farms to meet the climate goals. This is a hoax. And Ireland talked about slaughtering 200,000 cows to meet new climate goals. And German farmers are protesting against the fuel tax increases. The World Economic Forum wants you to eat insects, all to push their food shortages agenda. Watch this.
Zakon o obnovi prirode. Kako to lijepo zvuči, tko se ne bi složio s time? Međutim, Zakon o obnovi prirode. Kako to lijepo zvuči, tko se ne bi složio s time? Međutim, prava istina je da je ovdje riječ o samo još jednom ogromnom idiotizmu kakvog smo u ovom domu vidjeli već bezbroj puta. Jedini pravi cilj ovog zakona je konfiskacija privatnog vlasništva i oduzimanje poljoprivrednog zemljišta poljoprivrednicima, što ima krajnji cilj, a to je nedostupnost organske hrane građanima. Znači, želi se onemogućiti prosječnom građaninu da može jesti normalnu hranu. To je zakon, bi bilo bolje da se zove Zakon o nedostupnosti hrane građanima Europske unije. Nekada u komunizmu bilo je barem malo dostojanstva, pa su se zakoni o konfiskaciji privatnog vlasništva nazivali Zakonom o konfiskaciji. Sada ih nazivate Zakonom o obnovi planete Zemlje, obnovi prirode. Pa to su gluposti i idiotarije.
For so long, even the idea that we are not limited and bounded by availability of, let's say, gasoline, petroleum, or coal. Coal now they won't allow us to use, right? As you know, in COP meeting in Dubai that just ended a day ago, they just physically declared themselves that we should stop using fossil fuel. Basically, petroleum, natural gas, and even coal. I mean, these people are insane now, really insane. I think they're going to harm more people with their own delusion. Plus, they always remember, these are people who actually don't represent the majority. No. Since when are this put up to vote? It's always about this minority, the tyranny of the few, always robbing the whole census, the good census of the good people. This is part of the reason why, as a scientist, I also speak out. Not afraid of anything except for just telling the truth. And I'm glad.
So the push to cripple the agriculture is honestly a reality. What became of the Dutch farmers? What, in your view, what do you think will become of the German farmers as well?
As far as I'm concerned, they want to destroy farmers and independent farmers. They want to ensure that only corporate companies that take their orders from the top of the pyramid remain farming, and every individual who wants to use their heart, their spirit to grow food ceases to exist. Because the problem is, one of the places that ate the best chicken in the last 10 years was in France. They had this organic broiler chicken that tasted so amazingly. But that is being grown by the independent farmer. They're the ones that are still doing things according to traditional practices.
Okay.
Otherwise, what it is that the World Economic Forum want is they want only what are called CFOs, concentrated feed operations, where animals are raised in small little areas and they're fed chemicals, they're fed steroids, and then they feed people with this very toxic food.
Okay, they've already started doing that.
Yes.
The cows already are getting vaccines.
Yeah.
That obviously alter their DNA, their mRNA vaccines. And think about that. What is the outcome? If you were to eat a cow like that, what's the outcome of that?
Especially if you're a person who refused to be vaccinated with the mRNA vaccine during COVID, then they give you food that is gone. And this is one of the major things that I've been complaining about in Zimbabwe, for instance. The food, commercial food, tastes different from what it used to.
Absolutely, yes.
Yes, and
Absolutely.
many Zimbabweans are complaining that we used to look forward to coming home to eat very tasty, good food. But when we get home, when we eat the commercial food, it has no taste. The only time we get a reconnection with the food that tastes good is when we go to the villages. And the reason is, once this food is tasting different, it means there's something deficient in its nutrition.
The food, yeah.
The taste comes from minerals, it comes from chemicals, it comes from the makeup of the body of the animal. So when tastes change, it means something has changed within the creature. And there are studies that have been done by a professor from Dallas University, I'm just forgetting his name now, who said that there is an attenuation of nutrition the more you hybridize either animals or vegetables to make them grow bigger, faster. It means that they're using more energy, more minerals to make more of a body mass or more fruit, and that attenuates the amount of nutrition that is within the animal or the food. And this is why we're having health issues too.
That's it. There's so many health issues in the world today, and all sorts of funny diseases just mushrooming up, and they have names. And I asked myself, but the body that God created, the anatomy of the body is created in such a way that it heals itself. It takes out, it cleanses itself out. Anything that doesn't belong there is cleansed out. Now, if your DNA is altered, that ceases to happen.
100%.
The increase in cancer, talk about the respiratory system that is being attacked because of the vaccines, but just all sorts of things. People have sores that don't heal. People have headaches that don't go away. People just swell in the legs and you wonder. Children are being born looking like animals or something like that. It's also because of the foods.
And you've got an increase in autism among our children.
Which is a vaccine injury, actually.
It's a vaccine injury, but some have also said that there is associations between autism and glyphosate, which is usually found in genetically modified crops, which are dried utilizing this chemical called glyphosate that is also utilized for pest what you call it, controlling weeds.
Whoa.
And what we are saying, last time I was here, I spoke about how it is that there is actually a genetically engineered corn crop that can actually be eaten by women, and then it can kill the sperm that that woman takes in. And many people thought that was a conspiracy theory. This is a well-documented product that was patented in 2001 in America. And the company was listed on the American Stock Exchange, and its stocks rose and exploded because of them introducing this product. Now, many African countries are now adopting so-called technologies in the food space. We have an institution on the African continent created by Kofi Annan that is called AGRA.
Yeah.
And AGRA belongs to the Rockefeller Foundation, and I think that the Ford Foundation, together with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, also have shares in there. And their objective was to improve agriculture or production by technology. But what they were talking about is eliminating organic and traditional heirloom seeds to replace them with hybrids and GMOs that would allow these corporations, which have shares in the seed companies, to then control how we do agriculture. And once you have these seeds also require pesticides. Wow. These seeds also require fertilizers. These seeds also require the use of herbicides to kill weeds, so that when you plant this crop, it doesn't get affected by the herbicide that you put in there. But this means that Africa has to spend more disproportionately more on farming a hectare of land, because you now need seeds that you buy every year, you now need chemicals that you use as herbicides, and you need fertilizers.
And to think that we used to have a lot of subsistence farming without even worrying about pesticides and all that. Literally in the backyard of my mom's house, we had vegetables, we had tomatoes, we even had an orchard where we had fruits and all that. It was so easy to just go about life. Talking about fertilizers, I know this is one of the things that you're driving. You're talking about mineral fertilizers, but some people might not understand what mineral fertilizers are. What exactly is that?
Well, for instance, so you've got synthetic, we usually call them synthetic fertilizers, that are manufactured by the creation of chemicals extracted from nature or manufactured in the lab to create a fertilizer that's given to a crop. But unfortunately, these synthetic fertilizers are not natural in their state. So when you put them in the soil, they leach through the soil quicker. The absorption rate of the plant is different from the rate at which they leach through the soil. So usually they go through into the water table, they go into water bodies. If you see the green algae that you see in water bodies a lot of times, that's usually nitrites that have gone as runoff into water bodies, and that nitrogen begins to feed the algae, and that's why it grows more. And eventually, if you've got too much nitrogen and nitrites in the water, it creates so much algae that it kills everything underneath, because the sun can no longer penetrate through. And our farmers are not understanding this. And our PhD graduates that are conducting these farming things are trained agriculturally by institutions that were given a curriculum by the Rockefeller Foundation that wanted to sell its chemicals and its fertilizers. So they are miseducated. They're no longer farming the way they're supposed to. And just as an example, Zimbabwe always had traditional farming practices, because 80% of our people to 70% of our people lived in rural areas.
That's it.
And those people fed our liberation fighters when Smith was trying to choke them off from food. It took those rural communities to feed our liberation fighters and sustain a supply system of food that allowed us to defeat a very well-powered machinery. And right now, sanctions are supposed to have crippled Zimbabwe and destroyed it and made Zimbabweans vote for the opposition or remove their government by force. But because our rural people can sustain themselves food-wise, people lose their jobs, they migrate from the urban areas, they go to the rural areas, they can eat. The rural communities farm enough that when there's a drought or when there's not enough food in the cities, they send bags of food, bags of mealie meal to the cities, and people survive. That is why we've survived the sanctions, because of food self-sufficiency among the poorest of the poorest, who have got little gardens in the back of their houses. And even in the city, we're now using even all vacant spaces to grow maize that gives a person a bag of maize that lasts them for a year, so they don't have to depend on buying and money.
I was actually going to ask that. What are the margins of exportation or importing food into the country? For example, Zimbabwe. I know, like you rightly put it, Zimbabwe has always been like an agricultural-based economy. It actually generated most of its money in the past years through agriculture, growing tobacco, maize, and all those things. It was a given. But obviously, with the tempering of the West, with the farmers and agriculture in the country, I could speak for the whole of the SADC. How much food exports does the country do now, and how much food importing also does the country do now? Well,
for the past 3 years, we've been having surpluses in maize, wheat, tobacco, as usual. In fact, we've broken all records in all these crops from the records that were set in the past. And so we've become...
Using which seed?
That is a good question. There's a lot of use of hybrid seeds at the moment.
Okay.
And so one of the things that I have been at pains to try and communicate and lobby to the government of Zimbabwe is to say, we understand that you've done well to beat the numbers of the past, but are you self-sufficient? Is the seed yours? Does it belong to us? Is the practice that we're using, is it killing our soils or making our soils better? Are we being environmentally friendly? Are we protecting our forests? And these are issues that are still not open, and we're hoping that research will be done in these particular areas. Because if we're getting a wheat surplus, but the seed we're using can't reproduce and needs to be regrown every year or rebought every year, I think that's not food self-sufficiency in the true sense of the word.
Absolutely not.
Because any time that the seed owner decides to stop giving you seed, you've got a problem.
They can sanction the seeds.
Absolutely.
They can sanction the seed. These seeds are patented as well.
And especially if you look at, if the seed is controlled by these multinational companies that we spoke about, that are answering to intelligence organizations and think tanks and governments outside Zimbabwe or outside Africa, then that is food control.
totalitarianism at its best. So this speaks large volumes. You know, I'm thinking that probably if you looked at the food corporates, you would have thought that it was just a business model to supply at a large scale, but there's a more sinister agenda behind it. And I don't know if people actually understand this. Now, I want to talk about the diseases more, of how these foods are just spreading diseases everywhere. Did you know that foodborne illnesses, more commonly referred to as food poisoning, there's history behind food poisoning. It was never food poisoning, but it was somebody who tried to tamper with somebody's food and the person reacted in a bad way. Then they now called it food poisoning. Food was never poison. Food was always there to heal. So this is the result of eating contaminated, this is what they say now, a result of eating contaminated, spoiled, or toxic food, which means somebody tampered with the food. Do you get it? If you look at the history, somebody tampered with the food. And as you may know, the most common symptoms of food poisoning include feeling nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. But did you also know that the food that you may be eating every single day could be poisoning your body in the long run? Yeah.
There's a term we use called the health halo, where you have packaging says high in fibre or low in sugar, low in salt, plant-based, all of these kind of magic words that make people think, wow, these are really healthy. If anything ever says low, reduced or no, I'd always be a bit suspicious, because how else have they therefore made that food taste great?
In the last decade, the evidence has been slowly growing that ultra-processed food is harmful for us in ways we hadn't thought.
The twins find there is one ingredient they keep seeing again and again on food packets.
And then the emulsifiers again. We've seen that a few times, haven't we?
Emulsifiers are essentially a glue. They stick components together so that they have a good mouthfeel and they don't fall apart in your mouth or on the plate. So here we have carboxymethylcellulose, CMC, which is one of the commonest emulsifiers used in the food industry. And I'm just going to demonstrate what happens when you just add water to it, and it very rapidly becomes like a glue.
The food industry uses around 60 different emulsifiers to enhance the appearance, texture and shelf life of ultra-processed foods. Some are naturally occurring, others are chemically produced.
It's found in an incredible number of our foods, and they are potentially harmful.
Dr. Mathilde Touvier is leading one of the world's biggest studies into food additives, publishing regular reports based on the health and eating habits of 174,000 people. She's been looking at emulsifiers' long-term impact on health. The BBC has had exclusive access to the early results. They're yet to be verified by peer review, but she says they're concerning.
We observed significant associations between emulsifier intake and increased risk of cancer overall, and breast cancer notably, but also with cardiovascular diseases.
In England, Wales and Northern Ireland, food safety is regulated by the Food Standards Agency, the FSA. It says it's about to launch a public consultation on some emulsifiers. A spokesperson for the Food and Drink Federation said, "Food manufacturers take the health of consumers and safety of the food they produce seriously and adhere to the strict regulations. In the UK, all additives are independently and rigorously assessed to safety by the Food Standards Agency before they can be used in food."
Now, before I even hear from you, I want you to listen to this as well. You know the salt on your table, or maybe the turkey in your sandwich, the egg in your egg muffin, makes money off all of these things, like it's a business model, like we said earlier on. But you may not have heard of them, but Cargill is the biggest privately owned company in America, and they have near complete control over how and what you eat and how working people in the agricultural system are treated. Now, Cargill is a name that resonates in the corridors of the food industry, yet it remains a mystery to many. Known for its quiet but immense influence, Cargill is a titan in the world of agriculture, food processing and trading. That's a complete monopoly. Now, I just want to quickly show you this before I can hear what your thoughts are on this whole Cargill and monopoly as well.
It controls much of the world's food. It supplies inputs for McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and even governments around the world. And even giants like Nestle and Unilever use its products as raw material for their own products. And all this, in a way that is still little known, even after more than 100 years of history.
Deep in the heart of Wayzata, Minnesota, lies one of the biggest family dynasties in America, except you've never heard of their name. This family dynasty made more money last year than Coca-Cola, Nestle, and Chevron combined. In fact, they're the largest private company in the US, and this single company controls a massive share of your food supply. They're responsible for supplying food for some of the biggest brands out there, like McDonald's, Burger King, Kellogg's, Mars, Dunkin' Donuts, Unilever, Safeway, Kroger, Albertsons, Audi, Tesco, and many, many more. Look in your kitchen right now, and you're gonna find a ton of food made by this secret mega corporation. From cocoa powder to cooking oil, salt, sugar, eggs, meat, but you won't find their name on any of these labels. Most of you have never even heard of this name before. That's because this American dynasty has worked very hard to keep it that way. They don't want you to know what they're doing behind their factory doors. Because if you ever found out, you would never buy their food products again. It's that bad. What is the name of this family, you ask? Cargill. Cargill may have started out as a single shack on the side of the road, but today they're a whole lot bigger. Cargill is the largest private company in the US, and if they were public, they would be ranked number 15 on the Fortune 500 list, just in front of AT&T. And Cargill has its fingers in almost every pie imaginable, from grains to livestock to palm oil and coca, to metals, animal feed, energy, and even hedge funds. Their total revenue in 2021 was $135 billion, which is almost double the amount of what other big agricultural companies like ADM, Bunge, and Dreyfus made that year. In fact, this makes Cargill bigger than the entire GDP of Morocco. But if you wanted to buy some Cargill shares, you would be fresh out of luck, because Cargill doesn't want your peasant money. It is not worth it to them. Cargill has purposely remained a private company. For a lot of companies, going public on the stock market is the dream. But Cargill knows that if they went public, they would have to report everything to the shareholders, which would expose them to a lot of public scrutiny. But for what? It's not like they need the money. They already secretly control the food industry. There's a reason why their name doesn't ring a bell. Why? Well, you can't boycott something you don't know about, right? And there's a lot to boycott about. When you own an agriculture business, you're at the constant whims of nature. Droughts, floods, global shortages of seeds. All of that can be a very serious threat to your main moneymakers. What if your primary food export suddenly dried up one day? And that was the exact position Cargill found themselves in 1997 during the Asian financial crisis. See, at the time, Cargill was sourcing a lot of its crops from the Philippines, Taiwan, Indonesia, and Korea. But when Asia fell into a financial crisis, it caused a lot of the agriculture producers Cargill was buying from to close down. Suddenly, Cargill couldn't get soy, wheat, and corn from these countries at the same prices they were before. So Cargill ended up losing $4 billion, which at the time was the equivalent of 8 years of profit for them. It was one of Cargill's biggest losses to date, and it plunged them into debts. Understandably, the Cargill family panicked. So they shook up management and put a new guy in charge to hopefully lead them back to the promised land. And the man they chose to do that was Warren Stolle, one of Cargill's most loyal employees that had been working there since 1969. And when Warren Stolle stepped up as the head of Cargill, he did in fact lead them back to the promised land, but at a huge cost.
So clearly from this video, you can tell that it's an ugly, vicious cycle. It affects the finance markets, it affects people's health, it affects an economy of a country, it just destabilizes everything. But I want to talk about companies like Cargill that are fully in control of what is happening in the world today.
Well, many people don't know of the existence of Cargill. They don't know the existence of companies like Dreyfus, Cook Industries, Continental Foods, and Bunge. Now, in 1970, we had a global drought between 1970 and 1971. And 6 American companies, which include Cargill, Dreyfus, Bunge, Continental Foods, Cook Industries, controlled 90% of the world's grains. Because in that year, India was unable to produce as it used to, and Russia was unable to produce as much grain as it used to, because there was a drought internationally.
Yeah.
And at that time, the American companies, Cargill, Dreyfus, Continental Foods, and Cook Industries, and two others, controlled all the grain, 90%. So America was holding 90% of the world's grain in a world that needed grain, and they used this to advance American foreign policy. They used this to acquire what they wanted from the world. They used this even to get military bases into certain parts of the world.
Acquiring sovereign properties of the countries, of different governments.
Because they controlled the seed. And that has not changed. But this was not a mistake. This was a strategy that was started in 1979 by people like McKinnon and also Richard Nixon, together with the notorious Kissinger, who wrote a document in 1961 that specifically talked about how America needs to weaponize food and utilize food to control the world. So by the time we get to 1970, and Cargill, together with the other 5 companies, are controlling all the grain of the world, it was because of that. But how did they do it? They started making the world lose their traditional methods of growing agricultural products, growing grains, to relying and depending on American hybrids.
Hybrids, yeah.
Which then turned into GMOs in the 1980s and 1990s. So we have not learned. And with the coming of the hybrid came the dependency on American fertilizers, which destroyed our soils. Now we can no longer grow anything in those soils without dependency on these synthetic fertilizers. And then, because we're growing crops that are not tailored for our environment, they get eaten by pests that are indigenous to our areas, and then we use pesticides. Instead of growing what it is that is indigenous to our environments, which is adapted to the pests and which is adapted to the soils, we don't do that. And that's why now you see countries are growing things like maize in Zimbabwe. That maize is very water intensive. It's not suited for our soils. It makes our soils less fertile. And we need to start having scientists who are not going to take the agricultural system imposed on us by people that were trying to create markets and market penetration strategies through selling us their products, but we need to grow what works for us, what's good for our health, what's good for our soils, what's good for our environment.
I think that's where the next big question I was going to ask. So where do people still get the organic seeds? Are they even still there somewhere where ordinary people can actually reach them?
What I found very fascinating when I was speaking to some government official in Zimbabwe is they said that Zimbabwe has kept a seed bank of all their traditional seeds, but even when we have hybrids, we only allow hybrids when we know how to reverse engineer the process that you use to make the hybrids. So they want to know how you get your hybrid, where it comes from, what it is that you hybrid with, so that they can know how to reverse that, or they can know how to get the original seed. But I don't think we've got enough seed banks in Africa, even in Zimbabwe itself. And this is why the destruction of rural communities and rural traditions is something we should fight against. Because the only way to preserve some of these seeds is to have the rural people continue to grow what they've always grown, so that they can have this diverse genetics of maize. Do you know some of the highest maize genetics in the world is found in Zambia? And the highest rice genetics, traditional rice genetics, particularly the brown rices, is found in Zimbabwe. We have one of the most untainted rice varieties in the world. But we're allowing the seed companies and these monopolies that are not owned by locals to continue to taint and to go into our communities and market seeds and varieties that are not good for us.
Wow. And do you know, I think there needs to be that awakening from all our African policymakers and leaders. Africa can actually look inward easily. Africa has the mineral resources. Africa has the most fertile soils ever. Africa has large swathes of land. Africa has the organic foods, the original food that God himself created and gave to men. It should not be a difficult thing for Africa to quickly reverse this and adopt the old ways of growing food. I hope our viewers actually do understand the importance of the original seed that God gave to humanity, the importance of that seed, the importance of what you actually put in your bodies. So when you just see the farmers in Germany protesting, it's just not an ordinary protest. It's a protest that will come and bite you also. from whatever part of the world that you're watching from, it comes back to you. Because it's a vicious cycle of producing the food and distributing the food that we all need to understand and actually stand for. You know, having said that, I think that Bible verse actually comes to reality, where we say that even if I drink of anything poisonous, it will not harm my body. It wasn't because of a serpent that will come and bite you or speak poison in your water. It's this what we're talking about. The foods that we're eating that are poisoned every day, the water that we're drinking. Now, quickly, before I actually let you go, I would like to find out what you think about the toilet to tap water system that the global elites are also pushing for. You spoke about how the water also has been poisoned via the salts and all these fertilizers that people are using, and then they go into the water system. Do you think that's something that can be considered? Certainly not for me, though.
Well, you know, one of the things that I always say to Africans, because one of the problems we have is the African doesn't believe in themselves. And it starts with our leaders. They think that the Western way is progress. And I've always said, never forget that the European came to Africa for one specific reason. They had polluted their water, polluted their air, polluted their soils, and they had eaten every single animal that was walking on the ground, that they were now dying of hunger and killing each other in wars because they had scarce resources. That's why they came to Africa. And when they came to Africa, they saw clean waters, clean soils, clean air, and the very first thing they started to do is to destroy the animals, to destroy the soils, and to pollute the soils by bringing their tendencies that made them run away from Europe, which is defecating in the water that you're going to drink tomorrow. It does not make sense for you to take a clean body of water, defecate in it, send it to a factory, get it purified with chemicals, drink it and expect it to be fine. And then when you get sick, you take more chemicals to heal your body from the sickness that has been caused by this water that you've contaminated. It does not make sense for a mining company to come to Africa, ask for a mining license. You give them mining rights, a water license from a clean source of water.
Of water, yeah.
They put cyanide, they put chemicals, and then they put that water back into the system, and then you wonder why your water is bad. So look at the urbanization that we have. All our bodies, Hartepeesport Dam in South Africa, Lake Chivero in Zimbabwe, filthy with poop.
And the hyacinth weed.
Yes, and that hyacinth weed actually comes because of the the nutrition that is given by the poop. That's a sign that there is poop in the water. So all the water bodies that have no poop don't have hyacinth. The bodies that have poop have the hyacinth.
Oh, wow, that's new information there.
Now, you ask yourself, clearly this system doesn't work. And the pit latrine system that we dumped back in the day seemed to work better because it didn't pollute our waters, didn't pollute our water tables. Then you also ask yourself, what kind of fecal matter are human beings giving out now with all the junk that we're eating?
Thank you. That's a
Back in the days when you look in South America, they actually developed gardens, floating gardens that were fertilized by human poop. But the human poop we have now, filled with toxins, filled with chronic medication, is no longer poop, it is chemical toxins. It is biological waste. Because we ate from the beginning, we began to contaminate our bodies, and when we contaminate our bodies, we now have this poop that can no longer be biodegradable because it has toxins that will then become a problem for us tomorrow.
Oh, wow.
That whole entire value chain system has got to be rethought. And that is why people like myself, social commentators, activists, analysts, should be allowed to ventilate and voice problems that we see in our society with our public listed companies, with our corporations, so that we can get them to change their ways rather than for them to gag us and stop having a debate and a discussion in the public sphere that makes a better society for all of us.
Absolutely.
For America to have made the antitrust laws that they made to break up Standard Oil, which was the Rockefellers, they had to allow public discourse about what these corporations were doing to society.
Do they also target certain demographics and maybe races of people using the water system and the food system, obviously to achieve depopulation, if I may say?
Well, like the genetically engineered corn that I spoke about that got its license in 2001, it's targeted at women, and they can actually play around with genetics and the RNA to actually target specific ethnicities. This is something that was said by Walter Besson a long time ago, and it is something that Walter Besson, together with SIMA in South Africa, were working to create GMOs, foods, and diseases that will target only black people. Wow. This is well known, it's well publicized. We know, for instance, that when the eugenics project came about, the first pill that was made, Zyklon B, was made to target Jewish people and black people. Right? In Africa, we've got women are still being given what is called, there is this Depo-Plovera for birth control.
Okay.
Depo-Plovera is not being given in Europe and America anymore because it was seen to have serious side effects that could actually result in women not having children in future.
Infertility.
Infertility. Yeah. But we've got NGOs, American and Western governments, Planned Parenthood, giving Depo-Plovera on the African continent. In Israel, Jews that come from Ethiopia who want to resettle in Israel are given Depo-Plovera as a condition for them to be accepted as Jews into Israel.
Wow.
Right? And that is clearly a depopulation agenda.
Agenda, yes, it is.
And that depopulation agenda comes from Planned Parenthood, in which Bill Gates' father and mother sat as board members of the Planned Parenthood organization that looks at murdering young children in the stomachs of our women, and that has been the biggest form of black death in the world, is actually family planning and abortion.
Oh no, we've got the proof. See what happened in Kenya? See what happened in parts of Nigeria? There's proof that this is definitely happening.
It's
even
an
the
agenda.
push, yes, it is an agenda. I would love to have gone on and on talking about this because it's so important that people understand what is happening in their society. You can't just go and buy a fast food chicken piece and have it for the next 10 years of your life, because what you actually don't realize is that it's destroying your body. But thank you for shedding so much light on this whole food agenda, the war against food, the weaponization of food. And it is a sincere request right now that if we have any policymakers watching or listening to this, they better change those policies immediately for the sake of the well-being of their citizens and, of course, for the sake of their economies, and to just completely do away with totalitarianism from this deep state people and the agenda that they're pushing for eugenics. It's very important, actually. It's very important.
And our lawmakers need to make laws that are pro-public interest.
Absolutely,
and
yeah.
not laws for corporations. Corporations have an agenda to make profits. They have an agenda to exploit. They have an agenda to do whatever it takes, and it's not necessarily in the public interest.
Yeah.
We are sick and tired of judges that make decisions that are profit-orientated at the expense of the interest of the public.
Of the people, that's it.
That is unconstitutional, it's unconscionable, and it goes against human rights.
That's it. Well, thank you so much for being with me on the show. It's always good to have you on the show, like I said. And I hope the next time we talk about this, it will be a different story.
I hope so too.
It will be a positive story, that is. And to our viewers, thank you so much for watching Worldview today. We are back again, same time tomorrow, as we continue to view the world.